The following video and narrative are my opinion based on what I have seen and heard. You make your own decision. The video begins with Carlsbad City Councilman Kevin Shin talking about George Redis.
Last summer, there's a gentleman named George Redis. He's now a good friend, and he was going to his job site in a farm where ICE was there and raided. And while he complied and pulled over, he was still, they broke the glass, they pepper sprayed him, and they detained him.
Kevin doesn't mention that when George pulled up to the pot farm where he worked as a security guard, he was blocking the only open lane for the federal marshal's caravan to use. The caravan was getting ready to leave. George could have parked on the sides of the road where there was plenty of parking. Kevin doesn't mention that when George was told to move by the CBP officers, George said, "In my opinion, make me." Kevin doesn't mention when George got back in his car, he rolled up his window, the doors locked, and George's car didn't move for 16 to 17 seconds. It appears he only moved because CBP officers surrounded his car and were trying to break into his car to get him to move. Kevin, does that look like compliance to you? Kevin doesn't mention that George, in his own words, said that the CBP officers had to break in his windows to get him out of his car.
Side window just shatters. An agent sticks his arm through and pepper sprays me in the face. They drag me out of the car. They throw me on the ground.
Kevin, when did George comply and pull over voluntarily? Kevin, you said George couldn't make any phone calls while he was in custody.
For 3 days and 3 nights without an opportunity to make a phone call out.
I have seen and heard George admit that he was able to speak to his wife using his watch after he was detained.
I managed to make a call from my watch, and I call my wife and just let her know that I was detained by ICE. It was going to be okay.
George doesn't mention where he was at when he called her, but said he was detained by ICE. Kevin, you mentioned that no one knew where George was and that CBP wasn't cooperating, letting local law enforcement know.
And the family didn't know where he was. They made all attempts to contact local law enforcement, and no one was giving him an answer because at that time CBP and DHS and ICE were not providing them the answer.
Why would CBP cooperate with local law enforcement that won't cooperate with CBP? Also, George was detained at Camarillo at about 2 p.m. on Thursday afternoon and then transported to Port Hueneme, then from Port Hueneme to the Federal Detention Center in Los Angeles Thursday evening. George said he was put on suicide watch Friday morning.
I talked to a psychiatric nurse, and based off the questions I had answered, she felt like it was best to put me on suicide watch.
Kevin, if George was detained around 2 p.m. on Thursday, July 10, 2025, and was placed on suicide watch on Friday morning, and stayed on suicide watch until Sunday afternoon, then George spent less than 1 day in regular detention and over 2 days on suicide watch. So the majority of George's detention time was on suicide watch. It is not uncommon for people on suicide watch to be held incommunicado with the outside world. You failed to mention that George spent the majority of his time in custody on suicide watch. Kevin, you mentioned that the head of DHS has said U.S. citizens aren't detained.
What upset me even more is that the leadership above them also stated statements such as the director of DHS saying and preempting and saying that they had never detained any U.S. citizen at that time.
DHS statement about George's detainment mentions why he was detained outside the ICE raid. The statement says George allegedly became violent, refused to comply with law enforcement, and blocked their route, refusing to move his vehicle outside the ICE raid. That had nothing to do with immigration law, but you don't mention that. DHS detains U.S. citizens when they allegedly break federal laws that don't involve immigration law. You seem to conflate George being detained with him being a citizen that had committed some type of immigration crime. In my opinion, I don't think you know what you are talking about. At what point does it look like he complied and pulled over? Are U.S. citizens and veterans above the law? Protesters were throwing rocks at CBP vehicles. There is video of one protester shooting a gun, but you don't mention this. You talk about reasons not to trust.
What it did to me is it gave me a sense of mistrust. As soon as you give us mistrust, it's going to be so difficult for us to believe.
But in my opinion, you paint a picture that is inaccurate and incomplete. I don't trust what you say.
Come on, man.
George has not been charged with any criminal offenses. In his testimony to Congress, George Redis said he respects law enforcement. It didn't appear to me he respected law enforcement on Thursday, July 10, 2025. George mentions that accountability isn't the enemy of respect, but in my opinion, George has not taken accountability for his actions that day. George's description of what he did that day, in my opinion, doesn't resemble what the videos show. I guess George wants people to believe his words, not your eyes and ears. In my opinion, if George had just parked on the side of the road initially, or complied with law enforcement, which, if George had done either of those two options, in my opinion, George most likely would not have been detained. The narrative in this video is my opinions of what happened. You make your own conclusions.